Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to the Fall Environmental Resilience Speaker Series, jointly presented by Indiana University's Integrated Program on the Environment and the Environmental Resilience Institute. We're very happy that you can join us today. Before we start, Indiana University wishes to acknowledge and honor the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people on whose ancestral homelands and resources Indiana University was built. Both IPE and ERI are founded on the understanding that interdisciplinary learning and research are essential to teach today's scholars and to solve today's problems. IPE is dedicated to bringing together all of the environmental and sustainability scholarship across the various schools and departments on the Bloomington campus. IPE is made up of over 120 faculty and nearly 1,000 students studying the environment from all angles. The ERI was founded in 2017 as part of the IU Prepared for Environmental Change Grand Challenge. Its mission is to enhance resilience to environmental change in Indiana and beyond by accurately predicting impacts and effectively partnering with communities to implement feasible, equitable, and research-informed solutions. We have a wide variety of speakers joining us this semester and also in the spring. In particular, our speakers will focus on topics relevant to the issues of systemic racial inequality, environmental injustice, and the need for a just transition to a future that is healthy and safe for all people, not just those who have been privileged by centuries of inequitable systems and societies. So before the talk starts, please make sure that you've muted your microphone. As the talk happens, please, if you have questions, type them into the chat box, and at the end of our talk today, our moderator will present them to our speaker. So I'm going to turn it over to Lingxi Qinyang, who's the Environmental Law Fellow at the Environmental Resilience Institute, and she will introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Adam. Hi, everyone. My name is Ling Shi. I'm the new Environmental Law Fellow at ERI, and I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Shelley Suttles. Dr. Suttles is an agricultural economist who focuses on local and regional food systems, municipal food policy, agricultural energy production, and climate change's impact on agricultural land use. Dr. Suttles joined the O'Neill School as an assistant professor this year. She also serves as an assistant research scientist with the Sustainable Food System Science Institute at IU. Previously, Dr. Suttles served as the food policy and program coordinator for the City of Indianapolis's Office of Public Health and Safety, and as an economist with the USDA's Economic Research Service. And today she's going to talk to us about the potential environmental impacts of national transportation safety policy. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Suttles.
Thank you, Adam and Lingxi, for that great introduction. Let me just share my screen with the PowerPoint presentation. So first, thank you all for having me here today. I'm very excited to get to know more about the individuals who participate in the environmental resilience speaker series and research and all of the interesting things that happen in both IPE and ERI. So thank you very much. I'm new to IU, so I'm learning all of the acronyms, so you have to forgive me there. So again, I'm Shelley Suttles, and I'm with the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and also a researcher at the Ostrom Workshop Sustainable Food System Science Network. So, I've been working on this project looking at transportation safety policy in the context of food and agricultural production with my fellow economist, Dr. Tara Wade and Dr. Lurleen Walters at the University of Florida. So I apologize about my sound. Hopefully, let me know if this is any better.
I think if you could speak up a little bit or move the microphone a little closer.
Okay, how about now? Is this any better?
That's good, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I apologize. So this is a research project that came about because Tara is actually she has a component of extension education. So she works with community, being based at a land grant institution that is University of Florida. So in that she has an extension component of her faculty appointment. A tomato grower asked her in the middle of last year, he said, "Hey, this new transportation safety policy is coming about, and I'm very much aware that it's going to impact food and agricultural sectors. What should I look out for as a producer?" And so she told him, "Hey, I'm just hearing about it now from you. I don't know too much, but I'll find out." So she reached out to Lurleen and I and a couple of her colleagues at the University of Florida. And so we all said, "Oh, we really don't know about it, but let's find out together." So this is the research we've been conducting, looking at this new transportation safety policy that's known as the electronic logging mandate in the context of food and agricultural industries. So to start, we really have to think about the general role of transportation in the food system. So here we see in this diagram both supply side sectors and demand side sectors in the food system. And we see a variety of different, all the way from production in green to wholesaling and transportation in orange, um, consumer facing businesses such as retail grocery stores in blue, and then we have consumers at the end. So it's, a very robust system, the food system, and it has kind of interactions throughout. So it's just, stylistically, we're looking at logistics and transportation at the center of this diagram, but we know that transportation actually is affecting sectors in the food system throughout the system. So if we think about agricultural input suppliers sending uh, input supplies to farmers, if we think about farmers sending specialty crops or agricultural products to food processors and food manufacturers, wholesalers shipping product to retail grocery stores and institutional buyers, we know that transportation is really involved in a much more systemic way than just the one orange box we see here. So when we think about the volume of food and agricultural transportation in the United States, we can really think about looking at data in the US Commodity Flow Survey. So when we look at the 2017 survey, we see shipments for two food and agricultural commodities shown here. So there are 8, but we're just going to look at 2 here. And so the first is agricultural product shipments. And so U.S. Census defines agricultural products as generally specialty crops, so fresh fruit and vegetable, and it's not including cereal, grains, and animal feed and those other types of agricultural products. But at the same time, we also have prepared food commodities, which are shipped in the United States. And so prepared foods are what you can think about as processed foods or manufactured foods. So when we look at shipments of these two commodities by modes of transportation, we see that by weight, about 67% of agricultural products are shipped via on-road trucking. And at the same time, we see for shipments of prepared food, about 93% of these shipments are shipped via on-road trucking. So as a result, we conclude that on-road trucking is really a significant component to the food and agricultural industries, particularly food and agricultural transportation. So when we expand our discussion into on-road trucking to all commodities shipped in the United States by mode of transportation, we still see that about 81% of all commodities shipped in the United States are shipped via on-road trucking. And so this is equivalent to nearly 9 billion tons of product that is worth over $10 trillion. We know that on-road trucking is a very important industry for not only food and agricultural sectors, but for the U.S. economy as a whole. And so one thing that's quickly worth mentioning is that although we are going to focus today's discussion on on-road trucking, we do have rail, water, and air as modes of transportation. But it's important to think about these other modes of transportation. Ultimately, they are going to require on-road trucking to get that product closer to retailers and consumers in the end. So, nothing is purely shipped by water, nothing's purely shipped by rail, nothing's purely shipped by air. At the end of that, final destination, it's going to have to be shipped by on-road trucking. So, with all of this on road trucking happening across the United States to move product from here to there are going to be transportation safety consequences. So, in 2017, we unfortunately saw 878 fatalities that involved passengers of heavy duty vehicles in these long haul transportation routes. So, as a result, the Department of Transportation's Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has instituted transportation safety regulations to reduce the number of on road highway accidents as well as highway fatalities associated with on-road trucking or transportation industries. And so these regulations include general motor carrier regulations, just general things carriers must abide by in their operation of transportation businesses. It also includes hours of service regulation, which are kind of really looking at the human resource and hours of service rules related to transportation safety. And then we also have employee health and safety regulations instituted by the Department of Transportation. So in our discussion of transportation safety policy, we're going to focus on hours of service regulation. And it's because these hours of service regulation are intended to reduce fatigue driving, which generally causes these highway accidents and fatalities. So, according to the Department of Transportation, the hours of service really refers to the maximum amount of time that drivers are permitted to spend driving or on duty, what they would be spending time loading the vehicle, maintaining the vehicle, fueling the vehicle, and things of that nature. But it also at the same time specifies a number and a length of rest periods and breaks that are required intermittently throughout this hours of service. So when we look at hours of service regulations, we know that the Department of Transportation only allows drivers to drive 11 hours after 10 hours off duty. And they're only allowed to complete this 11 hours of drive time within a 14-hour window. So they have to do all of that 11 hours in a 14-hour window every day. And within these 11 hours, they're required to take 30-minute rest breaks for every 8 hours that they spend driving. And so ultimately, these hours of service regulations are there to help ensure that drivers stay awake, that they stay alert while they're on the road transporting, this high volume of shipments across the country. And so you might be asking yourself, so who's checking to see if these drivers are complying with these hours of service regulation? If you're driving from California to, Georgia, who is checking in to make sure you're complying with these rules? Is it Highway Patrol? Is it Eric Estrada perhaps from CHIPS? And so ultimately, pretty much. So drivers are required to maintain hours of service documentation in case they are audited by the Department of Transportation or their companies. But most drivers actually aren't concerned with the audits. They're concerned with being pulled over by Highway Patrol. And if Highway Patrol finds that they're not in compliance with hours of service regulations, this has the potential to jeopardize their commercial driver's licenses and ultimately jeopardize their livelihoods. So we know that prior to recent transportation safety policy, drivers were actually keeping paper logs. And so these paper logs weren't actually generally effective in terms of requiring or enforcing that drivers comply with hours of service regulation. And so in our review of literature, we find that drivers actually drove 4 hours each day beyond the maximum 11 hours that they're allowed to drive based on hours of service regulation. And this typically is in order to get product to its final destination in time. So especially when we think about food and agricultural products, Kroger wants those load of lettuce today because they put it on sale in the paper and people are expecting it. So particularly for the food and agricultural industries, on-time delivery is key. And so in an effort to avoid getting in trouble with Highway Patrol, drivers often kept two sets of paper logs. So they kept one legitimate set of logs for themselves and for their companies, but they also kept one set of false logs for Highway Patrol so that if they were pulled over, Highway Patrol would think that they were within their hours of service maximum, so that there was no issue with them driving additionally. And so very interestingly, the Department of Transportation knew this cheating or this double log activity was happening for a very long time. And they always asked themselves, is there an alternative technology to document hours of service compliance to ensure that drivers aren't driving past the maximum hours of service? And so actually, yes, there is. So the electronic logging device known as the ELD or E-log is a device that synchronizes with a vehicle's engine to automatically record drive times, let whoever's looking at the data understand when the engine was stopped, when the engine started, and this really offers very accurate recording of hours of service compliance. And so this is important because DOT felt the electronic logging device really offered the opportunity for drivers to have a safer work environment. So oftentimes it wasn't that the drivers wanted to push and drive beyond maximum allowable drive times, it's that their companies wanted it and that the company's clients wanted, that very on-time delivery. So the Department of Transportation argued that really this was to the benefit of drivers and it made it easier and faster to accurately record hours of service because in the paper log, it was often very difficult for drivers to keep these gigantic log books in the vehicle and record their hours of service. So it makes it easier not only to record, but also to share your hours on duty status with your company, highway patrol, or Department of Transportation auditors. So fortunately, the Department of Transportation moved ahead with instituting transportation safety policy, more specifically the electronic logging mandate in 2015. And so it had tried actually many times before to figure out a way to institute electronic logging devices in on um, long haul vehicles, commercial motor vehicles, but it was always opposed by the trucking industry. And that was until 2015 when the DOT passed the electronic logging device mandate, which now requires that all drivers and carriers of commercial motor vehicles have these electronic logging devices in the vehicles. And so the mandate came in 3 phases. So phase 1 was just the awareness and transition phase. It was a lot of PR on the part of the Department of Transportation to let drivers and carriers know that this was coming. Phase 2 was actually a year long between December 2017 and December 2019, and it was a phased in compliance approach. So it allowed drivers and carriers in the industry to really phase in the electronic logging devices into their vehicles. But during this time, so this 2 years of phase in compliance, agricultural industries actually received an exemption. That was until December of last year when phase 3 went into effect. And so now a majority of drivers, so nearly all drivers and commercial motor vehicle carriers in the United States are required to have electronic logging devices in their vehicles. And so there are a few exceptions. So agriculture does receive kind of a minimal amount of exceptions if you aren't doing long haul driving very much, or you're only doing it harvest season. There's other exemptions for the motion picture industry and other industries that may have varying frequencies and lengths of transportation and shipments and trips. But one thing it's really important to stress with its transportation safety policy, that is the electronic logging device mandate, that the ELD mandate did not actually change the hours of service rules. So the hours of service rules that we saw previously still stand. Nothing has changed about those. So the electronic logging device mandate only makes it harder for drivers and carriers to falsify hours of service records. And so ultimately that the DOT feels that they're able to better enforce existing hours of service regulations with this ELD mandate. And so in our efforts, as a group of agricultural economists to answer the Florida tomato growers' original question, we noticed, excuse me, we noticed something really interesting about transportation safety policy. And that's what that it very much impacted the food and agricultural industries and the economy as a whole. So we felt that it also had potential to impact the environment, animal welfare, and food waste, because if these trips are going to change, perhaps there would be more spoilage and changing routes. Um, Live animals and live fish are often transported on through on-road trucking in the United States, so that's why I felt there's potential for animal welfare impacts. And just we know that um, these commercial motor vehicles are consuming diesel fuel, and that there would be environmental impacts to any change in transportation policy that changed transportation times in the United States. So we really spent the last year exploring this nexus between transportation safety policy, food and agricultural policy, and environmental policy. So two important topics in food and agricultural policy that come to mind when we talk about transportation safety policy are first, food safety, and second, the keeping of food prices affordable in the United States. So in the topic of food safety, the FDA is responsible for regulating food safety in the United States. And so in an effort to keep consumers safe from foodborne illnesses through food spoilage, the FDA has various food safety regulations. One of the most recent and most profound was the 2011 Food Safety Modernization Act, which was passed. And so a major component of food safety, particularly FSMA, is this appropriate and consistent refrigeration of highly perishable goods. And this really impacts the food and agricultural industry because in the United States, a majority of product that is shipped via on-road trucking through refrigerated units is either food, flowers, or pharmaceuticals. So if there's going to be changes in food safety regulation, knowing that there are going to be highly perishable goods shipped in food and agricultural industries, this becomes very important. And this also becomes much more important given the trends in healthy eating that are encouraging Americans to consume more fresh fruit and vegetables. So it's all kind of coalescing at once. But at the same time, we know that USDA is tasked with keeping food prices low in the United States. And this is, particularly important given that when we think about what the USDA does in the context of the Farm Bill, we know that 76% of the outlays of the Farm Bill don't actually go to farmers. It actually goes to low income Americans who need food and nutrition assistance. So USDA is really looking to keep food prices low for low income households. So this 76% of outlays in the 2018 Farm Bill is about $66 billion that goes to low income households who may have food need. And so this is important kind of in the context of low prices. I know some folks argue about price parity for farmers, that they're receiving an appropriate price for their goods. But in the United States, there's only about 2 million farmers. At the same time, we know about 38 million Americans live below the poverty line and really struggle with food insecurity. So this is something that's very important to USDA. And so we, kind of in this vein would say that food safety, low food prices are really issues we think will be impacted by the change in labor, change in fuel, change in maintenance, change in travel time, that the electronic logging device mandate is having on the food and agricultural transportation industry. So at the same time, we can also think about environmental policy. And so we're very mindful that environmental policy is also going to converge with transportation safety policy. So in 2011, the EPA and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration got together and created greenhouse gas emissions and fuel economy standards for heavy duty trucks. And this was particularly important because EPA felt that this cohort of vehicles that would be produced between 2014 and 2018 could actually contribute to a reduction of about 270 million metric tons of CO2 emissions during this time period. So it's something that they were hopeful about involving commercial motor vehicles and improving environmental conditions in the United States. And so these issues are important to the transportation sector, particularly as fleets and as commercial motor carriers are trying to comply with fuel economy standards and emission standards, but they may have to cut costs in other areas to comply with these standards, and cutting costs in those areas may include cutting costs with labor, and that can affect drivers' livelihoods. So really, we're asking ourselves in this case, the following research questions. So how has the ELD mandate changed transportation time? How has the ELD mandate changed fuel consumption as a result of these changing transportation times? And what are the environmental consequences of the change in fuel consumption we might see? And so to answer this first question we look to at the change in transportation times as a result of the electronic logging device mandate. And so, as I mentioned before, this business as usual scenario where drivers were often driving 15 hours a day when they were only legally allowed to drive 11 hours a day becomes particularly important. So, with the ELD mandate, drivers will naturally spend more time completing a trip because they have to observe these hours of service rules, which require them to take a longer rest period. And so as a result, we know that transportation times will increase. And so when we look at our calculations to compare business as usual shipments with electronic logging device enforced shipments, we're really expecting to find increases in travel times for all routes that take more than 11 hours because drivers are no longer able to fudge that the 12th hour, the 13th hour, the 14th hour, and the 15th hour on road in their paper logbooks. The electronic logging device is actually now seeing when the engine was on, at what times, for how long. And so Highway Patrol, the Department of Transportation, and the motor carrier is able to track that much better than with paper logs. So now we know that every day on the road, driving will now be shortened to 11 hours when drivers were actually spending 15 hours driving. So we know that we're going to have changes for every multiple of 11 hours in drive time, because when a driver would have first spent the 15 hours driving, they're now spending 11 hours driving and they're forced to rest. And so this will happen, particularly for long distance transportation, knowing that, if it required, many multiples of 11, so, 25 hours, 35 hours on the road, going from coast to coast, there would be significant impacts in transportation times. And so here's just a quick table that's calculating transportation times for common agricultural routes that either end in New York or originate in Washington. And so we really see that this is going to be a big concern for very long haul coast to coast trips for food and agricultural products. So when we look at this route between Washington and Florida, we see that the electronic logging device mandate will likely increase the travel time of this 3,200-mile trip by up to 38 hours. And that's, obviously going to be particularly important for refrigerated transportation. And so just to give you guys an opportunity to see kind of the trend and the change in transportation times as a result of the electronic logging device mandate, here we see kind of, in orange, we have a line that would be the situation is if the business as usual transportation time was the same as the ELD enforced transportation time. But we know this is not going to happen as a result of the ELD mandate. So if we focus on the blue line, we see that the ELD transportation times deviate from the business as usual transportation times, and that they were going to require 4-hour rest period for every 11 hours, which didn't originally happen in the business as usual travel time. And so based on these changes in transportation time, we look to answer our second question. That was, what, if any, changes in fuel consumption are the result of the electronic logging device mandate? And so for me, these issues that are going to impact the economy, impact the environment, impact animal welfare, that are the result of the transportation policy are really what's hiding in plain sight to me. Because when we think about the electronic logging device mandate, it doesn't actually affect transportation mileage. So if we were to look in data for pre-ELD and compare it to post-ELD, the mileage of the trips will not change. The trips are always going to be the same mileage. So the shipment has, X number of miles that it will have to get the product from Washington to Florida, no matter what. But what is changing is the transportation time. So we know that, of all the publicly available data that we have at our disposal, none of the data actually has any mention of transportation times. And this is what we find is really lacking, but critical for the discussion of environmental impacts of transportation safety policy. So at first glance, you might say, who cares if transportation times change? The driver isn't doing anything while, he's resting in the vehicle. But there are actually quite a few fuel consumption activities that are happening while the driver is resting. And so the first activity is what is called hoteling. And so it's not a bad thing. Hoteling is simply the activity where the driver is resting in the cab of the vehicle during rest periods or breaks. And in our conversations with drivers, they actually said that they prefer to stay with the shipment and not get a hotel is because they're very concerned about theft. And so they'll typically, their goal is to get a really, beautiful cab like this one here in the picture and to be able to rest and relax during their rest period and breaks in the cab to protect the cargo. And so as you can see, hanging out in the cab is pretty nice. There's the mini fridge, a laptop, uh, a TV, all sorts of electronics and appliances at your disposal. But it's important to realize that while the driver is hoteling in this vehicle, it's going to require energy and power to keep the fridge on, to keep your laptop running, to keep Netflix on. So it's important for us to recognize that the vehicle engine is idling. And so EPA is estimating that all drivers are hoteling 100% of the time while they're doing these long haul trips, and that the engine is idling 70% of that time and consuming diesel fuel during that 70% of the hoteling time. And so at the same time, we have a similar situation for refrigeration. So the majority of fresh fruit and vegetable in the United States is shipped via refrigerated containers or what are called reefers. So when we see this kind of, this shipping container in the back, that's what's called a reefer. And so the reefer is outfitted with what's called a transportation or refrigeration unit. And so this requires diesel fuel to maintain cool, cold, frozen, or sometimes heated temperatures for food and agricultural products. And so while the driver is hoteling during these increased rest periods, the refrigeration unit also has to be continuously running throughout the route, which would include these additional breaks and rest periods. And so given the constraints that we have on available data for transportation times, we have to do a few back of the envelope calculations to estimate fuel consumption and CO2 emissions as the result of the electronic logging device mandate. And so here you see our fuel consumption calculation. And so we just take our previously calculated change in travel times. We include EPA's recommendations for conversion factors or fuel consumption for hoteling and refrigeration in a transportation refrigeration unit to ultimately find the change in fuel consumption as a result of the mandate. And so to get closer to answering our third question, we look at a change of greenhouse gas emissions as a result of the ELD mandate to understand the environmental impacts of the transportation safety policy. And so these are just additional calculations based on EPA's recommendations. So we take our change in fuel consumption calculation, use EPA CO2 conversion factor, and we're able to find a change in greenhouse gas emissions per shipment as a result of the change in transportation safety policy. And so to ultimately answer this third question we have to look at the change in aggregated greenhouse gas emissions, not just per individual shipment within the food and agricultural sectors to understand the impact of food and agriculture through the transportation safety policy. And so if we're going to aggregate emissions across each food and agricultural commodity, we have to go back to US Census and Bureau of Transportation Statistics Commodity Flow Survey. So here we're just looking at values from the 2017 Commodity Flow Survey for the survey's 8 food and agricultural commodities. And so highlighted in blue, I have commodities that will likely require refrigeration. So agricultural products, which are specialty crops or fresh fruit and vegetable in the United States, as we mentioned, are very much refrigerated in on-road transportation in the United States. We also have the potential in commodity 4, animal feed and eggs, where eggs would likely be refrigerated. But we aren't sure kind of the total aggregation of value that the commodity flow survey has aggregated. The same can go with, the same can be said for meat and poultry. We assume those commodities are transported via refrigerated trucking. And then we know to some degree for commodity 7, other prepared foodstuffs, that there are a variety of different manufactured foods that require refrigeration that are shipped across the United States. So ultimately, if we look at the average miles per shipment in the last column of this table, we see that there are short routes and there are, on average short routes and on average long routes for different food commodities. So short routes include number 2, cereal grain. So we see that's a relatively average short route for that commodity. Animal feed and eggs is also another commodity that has a relatively short route. So when we think about long haul transportation, there are some particularly long routes. So commodity 3, agricultural product, on average is being shipped 716 miles across the United States. Similarly, meat and poultry is shipped about 616 miles on average across the United States. And so the first thing we have to note here about the averages that were given from the commodity flow survey is that we don't know anything about the distribution of mileage given each individual shipment. So we can't say anything about the distribution. And second kind of is related to commodity 7, other prepared foodstuffs. This is really the 221 million million ton gorilla in the room. It is a very considerable amount, by weight of agricultural and food commodities that are shipped across the United States. But when we look at the average miles per shipment, they're really not that particularly high. So ultimately in our calculations, we don't include it, even though it is such a significant portion of food and agricultural commodities in the United States, just because the mileage isn't what we feel would kind of bump up on average against that 11-hour drive maximum. So if we look at our calculations, so we're able to calculate our change in transportation time given the certain commodities, a change in fuel consumption given certain commodities, and ultimately change in greenhouse gas for certain individual shipment of commodities. Highlighted in blue, we have things that we know that will require refrigeration throughout the transportation. In orange, we have long haul commodities that we don't feel would require refrigeration. And we look at these 4 commodities in particular because they have relatively long average miles per shipment. And so ultimately, we're concluding that agricultural products being shipped across the United States will have about a 0.25 teragram increase in emissions through the course of a year. Meat product transportation will have about a 0.29 teragram increase in emissions over the year. Bakery products will be a little bit less at 0.14 teragrams of CO2 emissions over the course of the year. And alcoholic beverages for our long haul trips will be about 0.09 teragrams of CO2 emissions over the course of the year. And so these are particularly conservative totals. As I mentioned, when we look in our average transportation times, we really don't want to force sectors that may have low average transportation times, to say that they'll be drastically impacted by this transportation safety policy. So we have a conservative total about 0.77 teragrams in total, which would be admitted annually based on long haul transportation of food and agricultural commodities. And so how did we fare in terms of answering our research questions? Ultimately, we find that there are increased transportation times as a result of the mandate. There is increased fuel consumption as a result of the changing transportation times. And there most likely will be an increase in greenhouse gas emissions as a result of the electronic logging device mandate. And so just to conclude, we say we estimate that there is a substantial increase in greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation safety policy, that's the ELD mandate. So we see kind of this less than 1 teragram annually for long haul food and agricultural transportation. But when we put this in context, even though that we feel that is substantial amount of CO2 emissions over the course of the year, it's ultimately fairly small in comparison with the total transportation CO2 emissions that we see annually. So in 2017, there was a little over 1,800 teragrams of CO2 equivalent emitted from the transportation sector in the United States. So not incredibly high, but perhaps, if we think about Department of Transportation and other kind of policy-making sectors across the economy, doing things to tweak the length and the time that it takes to transport product across the country, we will likely see these changes in fuel consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. And so for us, kind of as a group of researchers, we have a few avenues for our next steps. And so this is what I'd be curious to talk with all of you about. You know, in these avenues, first, we're going to take these preliminary calculations, and we plan to work with other general equilibrium modelers and econometricians to answer some of our large questions about the effects of this transportation safety policy on food and agricultural sectors. Because I did mention, this is going to impact labor cost, it's going to impact fuel cost, it's going to impact maintenance cost, and variety of different costs that are ultimately going to impact food and agricultural sectors and their ability to be economically efficient. And then our second avenue of research is also hiding in plain sight for us, because we've really realized that there is really no publicly available data that gives us comprehensive disaggregated data about food and agricultural transportation that would allow us to really refine the analysis we talked about today. We know that what is hiding in plain sight is the electronic logging device itself to give us data. So we know that the ELD mandate had a very long implementation process. So different states were implementing the ELD, some even prior to the announcement, the 2015 announcement of the ELD mandate. So there has actually been a relatively long history of drivers and commercial motor vehicle carriers recording their logs through ELD. So we would really be curious to get access to the direct ELD records themselves to see how drivers are better complying with hours of service regulation to improve transportation safety, but also to change the dynamic of food and agricultural transportation. So with that, I'll open it up for questions, but I thank you all for very much for kind of listening to that conversation during what has been a pretty exciting week.
Thanks so much, Dr. Settles. Who knew that trucking regulations would have such a large impact on food and ag? So our first question comes from the audience, and I think there are two questions here. Does the ELD mandate bring up any additional animal welfare concerns, perhaps by increasing the length of shipping time for live animals? And if so, have there been any proposed policy changes to address those animal welfare concerns?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we have found that for livestock, the kind of this increase in transportation time is going to be very important for live animals, particularly for cattle. So large animals who can overheat during transportation. So, there are a few publications that are coming out about the effects that the ELD mandate will cause in terms of cattle transportation. But one thing we're all concerned about, so we're all kind of resource economists on the side of being ag economists, is pollinators. So I'm sure everyone on this call knows kind of pollinators are shipped all across the country. That's how people can have their almond milk some poor driver gets stuck, transporting hives all across the United States to pollinate all the things that need pollinated. So if ELD mandate is going to require that the individual driving pollinators across the country spend more time resting, this can be devastating for the hives because much like the cattle, if the hives overheat, it will decimate the hive. So, the clients who are shipping the hives all across the country are very, very critical about on-time delivery for hives. And so this will have both livestock, concerns for animal welfare in regards to livestock, but also pollinators.
That's really interesting that there would be a big effect on pollinators. Our next question is, have there been any measurable safety results for truckers based on the mandate?
Yeah, so I was nervous somebody would ask this question. So this is not my area of expertise. We've only been following kind of researchers who conduct transportation safety research. And really right now the jury is out. Uh, you know, there have been publications both ways saying that the transportation safety policy is effective, but there's also been publications that say that really what you're seeing is not necessarily the case in terms of improving, highway accidents and highway fatalities. So that's something that we definitely following because ultimately that discussion is what has been the impetus for all of the research we've done in this area.
Got it. So it seems like the evidence is mixed. So I have a personal question. I'm really interested in sort of the large scale macroeconomic changes that the regulation might cause for food demand. So I'm wondering whether the ELD mandate might influence food demand by, increasing the supply costs for certain food sectors. In your presentation, you mentioned that um, the meat industry might be particularly affected. I'm wondering whether it might hike up prices for meat and supermarkets and stuff, and whether this might kind of shift food demand away from those sectors influenced.
Yeah, so meat's a great example. You can think about the macroeconomic effects. So, we had the discussion about the increase in transportation time for livestock. So, if you think about the cattle that will ultimately become beef, those economic costs are increasing. So, that labor, that fuel, that maintenance, and what have you, those costs are increasing. And that's compounded with the increase in transportation times for meat. And so this is going to be a double whammy. And when we think about low income households who may not be able to bear the brunt of the industry passing on those costs to them, it could ultimately have significant macroeconomic effects.
That's really interesting. And what about for, I'm guessing it'll also hike up prices for those agricultural sectors that rely on pollinators, which is, I imagine, a huge segment of agriculture.
Yeah. So, I guess I missed a tiny component of the first question to say, had the industry, so had the Department of Transportation kind of given any exemptions for considering animal welfare in the transportation? So there actually have just been kind of one small concession. And so that's really more motivated around the actual farm operation. So the hours of service regulations don't actually count. So you're given an exemption 150 air miles around an agricultural operation. So say if uh, you have a nursery on site and you're planting lettuce. So you have a lettuce nursery and a lettuce farm, and then you go to your nursery and plant your lettuce all within your 150 air miles. You don't have to count that towards your hours of service regulation. But as you saw kind of in common routes for food and agricultural products, they're crisscrossing the United States. So they're well beyond that 150 air miles that the Department of Transportation has given agriculture. So I guess, the industry is always kind of trying to um, find opportunities to get greater concessions from Department of Transportation, given that so much is happening within the food and agricultural sector.
Right. Um, a question about the truckers. I wonder if truckers are in support of the mandate. I mean, it seems like it's already going to be in effect, but I'm wondering how truckers feel about this particular regulation.
Yeah, we did a handful of interviews with drivers, particularly during COVID, because we were wondering how kind of all of this was coming together all at once during a pandemic where they were forced to really kind of push to the limit. And we asked them, how has the ELD mandate affected you as a driver? Or we talked to transportation directors at food and agricultural businesses and asked them how it affected their work. And majority of them said that, particularly those that were in progressive states like California, they had actually long adopted the ELD mandate, the ELD as a device in the vehicle prior to the mandate. So we heard from drivers, that Idaho, I think, was what they said was really at the forefront of electronic logging devices, because it ultimately does make it easier for the driver and the carrier to track hours of service. This is just also at the end of the day, HR issue. I need to know how many hours you work to pay you. So it'd be helpful if I had a better mechanism to track your hours of service. So a few states and a few businesses had long since used the ELD as a HR tool. So we're that's where we see this opportunity to look at ELDs pre and post the mandate to understand at a granular level what may have happened.
Right, that's interesting that it's already being implemented in these Western states. I mean, it seems like a common sense technology adoption kind of tool to track those hours.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
drivers, at least from one, so I talked to a Midwest transportation director, and he said that he did see a few retirements prior to the ELD going into effect because, older drivers said, I don't want to really learn a new technology. I'm already on the cusp of retirement. I'll just call it quits now so I don't have to learn a new gizmo. But I don't think it was like severe pushback into having the ELD. Although if you do look at forums, so I wonder, I see Stacy's on the call. I wonder kind of those who do social network analysis and see how drivers are very chatty group. They had the CB radios in the old days, and they very much connect with each other 'cause they kind of have the opportunity to chat on the road. But there has been some lively discussions about the ELD mandate, but we see it both ways, particularly during COVID. Interestingly, there were 5 days that the White House actually waived all hours of service regulations for commercial motor vehicle drivers. And only lasted 5 days because the Department of Transportation stepped in and said, this is crazy town. You have to have hours of service regulation or people will die. And so we looked kind of in the trucker chatter online to see what truckers were saying about that. And it was interesting. A lot of them said, hey, you need these hours of service regulations to enforce safety. You've told us this. We have to comply with this during COVID, even. You can't, throw the baby out with the bathwater in this case of transportation safety.
yeah, and we see kind of similar reaction from the car industry generally to rollback of environmental regulations from this administration. I'm also wondering whether the supply cost increases from this particular regulation might be a big boost for automated trucking. I know that that's kind of on the horizon. I wonder if that might become, um, a more attractive option for these like big box stores and big suppliers, given the additional costs of compliance.
Yeah, definitely. Because in that case, so even outside of the ELD mandate, just with general having a human drive the vehicle, if a human wasn't driving, there would be no need for hours of service regulation. And you could get, from Washington State all the way to Florida and no rest whatsoever. So I think that would be a very big game changer. But kind of in that conversation, as folks wait to figure out kind of the status of driverless long haul transportation, the industry is discussing kind of more tandem driving, and that's where you'd have two drivers in the cab. So while one is getting their rest, taking their mandated rest period, the other driver is driving, and so that they're able to complete the shipment in the normal amount of time with that tandem driving. So there are kind of industries discussing different ways to deal with the mandate, but at least kind of in the conversations we had with drivers, they don't seem concerned. They say, oh, it may take a little longer. I'm not trying to jeopardize my license, so I will follow the rules.
That's a really interesting workaround the regulation, the tandem driving solution. It seems totally commonsensical to have two drivers to get around that rule.
Yeah, the only
Um,
thing is now you're paying two salaries for the same trip.
oh, right. Yeah, that would definitely increase costs. So maybe it's not so advantageous all around.
But then, yeah, so I guess, especially if we think about outside of food and agriculture, it may make sense. Nobody is necessarily asking that you keep, plasma screen TVs at a low cost. So maybe there are certain sectors of the economy, shipping commodities, who would say, okay, we'll go for this increased labor cost. But food and agriculture, they may have to have another concession to deal with increasing labor cost.
Right, right. Another question about kind of broader macroeconomic impacts of this particular regulation. I'm wondering whether the mandate will give local food supply chains a boost as well. If it's more costly to ship things across the country because of this increased shipping time. I'm wondering if it might be a boost to the local food supply chain, so to like farmers markets and local food suppliers rather than big box stores.
Yeah, so I think, kind of that's always the question ag economists grapple with, kind of where do you see efficiencies in agricultural production? Um, so one thing we're also, interested to know, on-road trucking, I've just kind of narrowed the scope of the conversation here now to the US, but we also have Mexico and Canada, which are very much involved in North America. So there's millions and millions of tons of product that are coming from Mexico and Canada. So you can think about, local in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico could be from Mexico, local in Michigan and Minnesota could be Canadian, and all of that is still on-road transportation. Um, but not necessarily kind of in the argument of, um, you know, I'm buying local because local is my people. It's more kind of, okay, well, um, geographically local could mean different things to different routes. And then also, just generally have to think about agricultural production and agronomy. So some things grow better in some places. And, us trying to grow pineapple in Indiana um, will never be cost effective. So, we'll have to think about other mechanisms to get that product here. Um, but that is I imagine always a topic of discussion, kind of adjusting regional and local food systems to deal with other issues that are policies that are external to food and agricultural industries.
Right. And along the same lines, I wonder if there are any impacts on foods that are transported via air. So like the pineapples that you mentioned. Given that the trucking industry is being influenced by this regulation, there's kind of an indirect boost to foods flown in from South America and faraway places. Um,
Yeah, so as you saw in the graph I showed for agricultural products, less than 1% of agricultural products are shipped by air. So I'm not exactly, I don't want to misspeak, but I imagine it's kind of very niche, high-end products that are coming in by air. Most would either come by, water or, depending where they're coming from, perhaps if they're coming from South America, they may um, come by other mechanisms, rail, if there's kind of a decent rail system. But just generally, because of the volume of agricultural products, they aren't often shipped by air.
right. Yeah. It seems like there are so many interesting like indirect effects from this regulation. But yeah, it seems like if air is only 1%, then it might not have such a big impact.
Or it may make room for air. So now they say, well, at first we were on the cusp of shipping it via on-road trucking because it was cheaper than air. But then now we know, oh, it's going to take, 38 hours longer to get my shrimp from Washington to Florida. It may make it more economically feasible to start using more air transportation. So this is what we're kind of curious to get the granular data again to know kind of, oh, okay, at what point for what style of shipments, what commodities are we seeing these big changes, or, or maybe even small incremental changes away to other alternatives?
Right. Well, Dr. Settles, thank you so much for your talk and answering these really interesting questions that come from your research. Yeah, that's the end of our talk, and I'll turn it over to Adam.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Suttles and Ling Shi. Everyone have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you guys. Have a great weekend.